Kodwo, dear George, very nice to see you in this sort of corona-induced new types of, I don't know, landscapes. You said, Kodwo, before, new forms of being together, I guess, in creative ways that is not just related to Zoom interfaces. So this is the common garden of Savvy that is actually being used, I think, as a platform to launch a number of publications that have been produced in the past years, and I must say it is quite a joy to hear. I haven't received it materially myself neither, that this book has finally been published 3 years later. As you know, we're talking about, we have delivered ourselves from the Tonal, which has been some sort of a collective effort to quote Kodwo, actually recover and restitute somehow the erasure that Julius Eastman's work had been undergoing, let's say, in past decades, and in a sense became a moment in 2018 somehow to tune, to assemble, to bring together, I think, a number of people that had been either already working with Eastman at the time and during his life, or had been influenced by his work, had already abundantly written about his work, or actually had encountered it for the first time and were encouraged by us to produce new creative works, somewhat inspired by his practice. We're very happy to have you both, given that you contributed, I would say, in various ways to the making of both the exhibition that preceded actually the public program and the public program that we had back then, 2 intense days of ongoing contributions for, I think, a total of almost 15 hours of footage that is also still available online. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to both of you, because I think that everybody probably listening in today will know who you are. Kodwo Eshun is a writer, theorist, academic, writer, artist, currently lecturer in contemporary art at the Goldsmith University, as much as also in the Department of Fine Arts of the Haute École d'Art and Design of Geneva, author of a book that I heard actually, and I read somewhere, will finally be republished in 2025, which I think is creating a lot of waiting momentum, More Brilliant Than the Sun, an extremely influential book for a lot that relates both to this program and I think in general to the work of Savvy Contemporary. And of course one of the members of the Autolit Group, a film collective with Angelica Sagar, whose film on Eastman was part of the exhibition, and also actually a text around the work is also part of this book, written by George Lewis, American composer, electronic performer, artist, trombone player and scholar, who has also published widely on experimental music and already in the past on Julius Eastman, and whose contribution, again, creative as much as academic, to both our public program and this book is absolutely fundamental. So we're very, very lucky to have you both online experimenting with us this common garden. And I would just invite you maybe just to say a brief few words of hi before we actually listen to an introduction pre-recorded by Bonaventure and Ndikung.
Well, hello. Hi, Antonia and Bonaventure and Kodwo, and I'm really happy to be here. And I think wonderful things will happen over the next hour.
Yeah, likewise. Hi, George. It's always a pleasure to meet you in the common garden or otherwise. Hi, Antonia. Thanks for your good energy throughout this process and through all the years. To Bona and all the Savvy team. And to the Merlins, the wizards behind the scenes, keeping all of this going. Thanks for all your patience. And I'm looking forward to the next hour and a half.
So we do have a big kind of lineup, and I think the first of which is an introduction by Bonaventure Ndikung, and I think our wizards in the back are about to play.
Welcome to the presentation of the book we've delivered ourselves from the Tonal of, towards, on, and for Julius Eastman, which is a reader based on a project we did a couple of years ago on the work of the groundbreaking seminal artist Julius Eastman. This was a project of and for listening, a possibility of getting to know Eastman and his work more intensively, and the possibility of thinking about the way history is written, especially the history of music. So one could say it was a project about de-erasure, undoing that which was erased, and a project actually of agitation, shaking the history of music from its very foundation. So we invested in, a deep study of Julius Eastman's scores, and actually commissioning artists to listen to the work and produce sculptural pieces or sonic pieces in response to Julius Eastman's work. What few people know is that Eastman was also a brilliant performer. So we invited people to create performances around that work. So I will read two excerpts from the reader. One is a conversation I had with Antonia, Alampi, and Benno Odopolza, who were co-curators of the project. And it is about the Eastman moment, when we all kind of get to know Julius Eastman. Then I'll read a bit from the concept of the project that I had originally written, so to give an impression of what the whole project is about. But I'll start with the conversation. Indeed, everyone familiar with Julius Eastman's work has their Eastman moment. Mine is rather extended, and I would dare to say that whenever I listen to a newly found Eastman piece, it becomes that Eastman moment. I grew up in a town called Bamenda in the northwest province of Cameroon. Museums and libraries were a rarity in the 80s and 90s and even today. A place with an extremely rich musical tradition, especially African and African diasporic music of all genres, which one could hear blasting from the huge speakers of what one might choose to call today DJ, who would record what you wanted on a cassette sur place. Any other genre of music came to us through the medium that collapsed the world into one small box, the radio. Stumbling over BBC, VOA, or some other unknown stations, some notches up or down upon tuning, we encountered the music of the likes of Philip Glass, Steve Reich, Lamonte Young, and others, whose short, very sparse, repetitively varying, and almost hypnotic musical phrases echoed from ayonder. We were dutifully informed by the eloquent journalists that this avant-garde music was minimal music. I can't remember ever coming across the name Julius Eastman in any of those seminal radio programs. Another bridge to the world in the 1980s and 90s came through television, but even more significantly through relatives that had migrated from Cameroon to Europe or the US. Every year, one of such Cameroonians based in New York would send his little brother in Bamenda magazines and journals like Newsweek, The Village Voice, The New Yorker, and others. All these magazines came to Cameroon 1 or 2 years after publishing and were sold in the market as treats, traded like hot cakes. It must have been 1993 or 1994 when I read in one of these papers about a black minimalist composer who had just passed on. I remember I was fascinated by the story of a black genius in this field of music, which had been portrayed to me on radio as an exclusively white thing. I also remember how stunned I was about the circumstances of his passing, that in the mind of a teenager in Cameroon seemed the most unlikely tragic way of crossing to the beyond. But soon enough, this story got buried in the pile of other stories in the head of a teenager I was. In hindsight, I think the article I had read back then might have been Kyle Gann's That Which is Fundamental, Julius Eastman, 1940 to 1990, on the passing of Julius Eastman in the Village Voice of the 22nd of January 1991. It might have been, or perhaps not. Maybe my memory is playing tricks on me. Fast forward to 2005, when the stunning album Unjust Malaise was released, and then 2007, when Stacey Hardy wrote 52 Niggers for the Chimurenga magazine. That is how Julius Eastman came into my life again. At the time, just after defending my PhD thesis in the sciences, but feeling completely lost somewhere in laboratories between Heinrich Heine University in Düsseldorf and the Technische Universität in Berlin, I sought to resituate myself in writings from the African continent. Chimurenga magazine was an anchor point, and they redefined the way texts were written about Africans on the continent and the diaspora eventually led to my encounter with Eastman's work and music through this piece on Eastman written by Stacey Hardy. So I'll end there for this section. So I'll go to the concept text, which is titled A Prologue. We have delivered ourselves from the tonal off towards on for Julius Eastman. And it starts with a quote, actually excerpts from notes in a score that Julius Eastman wrote, the score for the Moon's Silent Modulation from 1970. And it reads, "Light streams through the darkness, opening the caves. Light, sorrow, light cannot shine where no light is. Truth is light and darkness. More light, more light, more light, more light. Light is not darkness." Julius Eastman, notes in the score for the Moon's Silent Modulation, 1970. One can't help but think of the metaphor of light that has so much informed and still runs through the veins of what one might want to call Western civilization. It is the strong craving, or the rhetoric thereof, to beguile that light from the biblical invocation, "Let there be light," and transpose it into the world that led to the age of exploration. It is the paradigm of seeing the light, which implies an awakening that is at the core of the concept of the Enlightenment project, the age of enlightenment, the age of reason. That age in which knowledge was light and light was truth, manifested in the rationality of the social, economic, political, and religious. An era in which To dare to know meant escaping from the Platonic cave into the light of the day, and that quest for light consequently led to the scramble for a place in the sun, arguably another effort to get more light. For light to shine where light is, one either needs to create even more darkness. Thus, the construct of the journey in the heart of darkness, or one needs to shed an even stronger light. One of many possibilities of shining light where light is through nomenclature, giving names to things that already exist, reinventing the already rolling wheel. To say that abstraction is modernism's greatest innovation, and that abstraction was founded by Kandinsky, Leger, Delaunay, Kupka, and Picabia in 1911, is making light shine where light already is. To claim that Lamonte Young's 1958 trio for string is the starting point of minimalism is making light shine where light is. Composer Dieter Schnabel even went as far as to justify the apparition of minimal tendencies in art and music in North America based on the fact that America simultaneously represents the New World and the Wild West, which implies an orientation towards the future without demolishing existing structures and embracing a pioneering spirit of experimentation. More light, light is not darkness. In his seminal lecture on the minimalist impulse in African music creativity, Kofi Agawu states that, and I quote, "Among the wonders of African creativity is the ability of certain individuals to spin large tracts of musical thought from a minimum of resources, 2 or 3 pitches, a pair of contrasting timbre, or nuggets of distinctly shaped rhythms. This minimalist impulse is widespread throughout Africa. Anyone familiar with traditional African music will readily call to mind styles and idioms animated by extensive or even obsessive repetition. Insofar as the minimalist manner is constituted by repetition, what brings us insight is thinking through these familiar repertoires once again as intentional actions motivated by a minimalist aesthetic. In other words, I want to make explicit through denomination the minimalism that has been implicit all along in African musical studies." End of quote. If one were to take the aforementioned minimalist tendencies and impulses seriously, handing over the term minimalism to the inventors and bringers of light, and if one were to believe in the migration of the sonic as well as the impact of sonority on spaces and subjectivities as enablers of most of the sounds that have defined the 20th and 21st centuries, then one could look at or listen to Julius Eastman's work within this genealogy. This is to say that if Africans in the New World brought with them the sounds that were to become the Negro spirituals, the blues, jazz, funk, R&B, hip-hop, etc., then there is no reason to think that they had left their minimal tendencies behind them. I'll just read one sentence towards the end, and then it's done. It is worth listening and reading Eastman's music within the scope of what Oluwaseyi Kehinde describes as the application of chromatic forms such as polytonality, atonality, and dissonance as the fulcrum in analyzing some elements of African music such as melody, harmony, instruments, and instrumentation. Though Eastman shouldn't be reduced to the dichotomy of tonality versus atonality, there is still the need to research how Eastman tries to shed light into tonality, which is deeply embedded in Western civilization. Light streams through the darkness, opening the caves. Light, sorrow. Light cannot shine where no light is. Truth is light and darkness. More light, more light. More light, more light. Light is not darkness. At the very end of the scores for the Moon's Silent Modulation, 1970, Eastman writes, "We have delivered ourselves from the tonal."
As a sort of beginning of conversation, just something that I feel we were already thinking back then in 2018, but I feel even more strongly for now, which is really what I was saying before about, it's 3 years ago that the program happened, and a lot has changed, and I'm just curious to know how you see, such programs or even the work of Eastman in relationship to now, and whether the number of programs that actually I think also happened around that time, of which Savi was one, but there was quite an attention that was, not just coming from Europe. There was a big program also done in the United States, for example. I remember just a few months before instead, in fact, and I'm just thinking, Eastman, from the perspective of today, 3 years later, the program, how do you see him now? How do you see his work now within even just academia and academic studies, music world and publishing and writing, and whether his music in particular is in a sense more present or a certain more complex reading that we were also aiming for has surfaced in the past years.
Well, what I remember when we were in the what was it, the Silent Green, and we were
exactly,
and we were doing the talks.
Yeah.
And Kodwo was speaking, and he said this amazing thing that I, been sort of indelibly fixed on my brain ever since. He said, "The work of forgetting the black avant-garde never ends." And this is kind of a classic phrase that reminded me that in fact, it's not just the work of the black avant-garde that gets forgetting, it's all kinds of Afro-diasporic cultural production, particularly in many fields, that gets forgotten. And so to me, focusing on Julius Eastman was very important because of the amazement in the work while he was alive, and then having it be totally forgotten, and then having it be recovered with the work of Mary Jane Leach, Savvy Contemporary, Kodwo, all these kinds of people. But it reminded me that there were a lot of people that had been forgotten, and not just him. And so, and I'm noticing that the current work on Anton Wilhelm Amo is a perfect example of someone who's forgotten. And I sent a copy of the book to my philosophy colleague here at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, where I am now. And she works on Kant, and she'd never heard of this person. She's a major philosopher in the field. So this points to the need, and even the year before we did the Savvy event, when Märzmusik, Berliner Festspiele, enormous concert, 4 pianos, all this kind of stuff, amazing. All very different than my experience of it when I heard it the first time.
Which was already collaboration with Savvy, actually, because our collaboration on Eastman started then, and we had a smaller contribution and a smaller program, and that led to the second edition, which was also quite interesting that the Märzmusik decided to really open the festival 2 years in a row with the work of Julius Eastman, which I think was also important in relationship to continuity, as opposed to this, I think, approach to, underquote, discovery, that sometimes is precisely done over artists, musicians, philosophers, that are engaged with very shortly to then, move on.
Well, but I can tell you what it did for me,
Yeah.
Savi's work and also the work before, because having known Julius when he was alive, and seeing that the energy was still there. But then as I'm listening to the concert, I'm thinking, a lot of these people probably think it's the only black composer in the history of the world. And that's not true. And so I started plotting at that very moment to do what I'm doing for this edition of Merits Musique, which is to reprise our Afro-modernism in contemporary music effort, which is a complete concert of Afro-diasporic composers. And when I use the word diasporic, I'm talking about a network. It's not home and tributaries anymore. Everybody's diasporic at this point. There's so much movement, it's hard to know where's home. So, for example, we're programming people like Andile Khumalo from South Africa, and we're programming Jesse Cox, who's Black Swiss. So what that does, first of all, is it opens, Julius becomes a way that we can open up to a new world. And I think in many different ways. So I think that's what it did for me. And I think it's continuing to bear fruit. I mean, we're starting to see with the current interest in Black Lives Matter and what's happening there. I've been in Germany for a while, researching Afro-German histories and so on, including my former student, the musicologist Harold Kasidu, who's working with me on these projects. And so I'm starting to see that this overall approach of Savi, Amo, Eastman, other groups.
Halim El-Dab this year, actually.
Excuse me?
Halim El-Dab now with the new, yeah.
Yeah, and so it's bringing an entire new world to the fore. So, I mean, if we could talk about Eastman in particular, but I just wanted to get on the table that focusing on Eastman has caused us to be able to open up to all kinds of perspectives that really people didn't know about.
I think that makes so much sense. I mean, I'm thinking about Halim El-Dab because it's George who introduced me to Halim El-Dab.
I did that?
You did. I was over at your apartment and you said you might be interested in this. And you gave me this CD which had the wire recording. And that was what I knew about, but I hadn't heard it. I'd read about it. You gave me this CD which had the wire recording piece and many other compositions by Halim El-Dab. That's more than a decade ago now.
Wow.
And so it speaks to as you say, the question of the Afro diaspora, which is a borderless world. Diaspora is not a country. The borderless imagination of the Afro diasporic composer. And when I think in this present moment of this Halim El-Dab exhibition and thinking with his work and the energy around that project, which a lot of us have been waiting for a while, it takes me back to 2018, because there we were in a way thinking of two related questions. On one hand, Julius Eastman was a kind of a figure that brought together George's thinking about the figure of the Afrological experimental composer who poses a problem for popular music, and who also poses a problem for experimental music. So who gets written out of both of those discourses precisely because they pose a problem to the coherence of popular music and the coherence of experimental music. And Eastman appeared to exemplify that. So that was the question of their problematization. But then that moment of 2018 was also the problem of the terms upon which the recovery and restitution of Eastman was taking place, which was under the terms of exceptionality and under the terms of a kind of voyeuristic fascination with Eastman's queerness, Eastman's gayness, Eastman's blackness, Eastman's flamboyancy, so that so these questions of the terms of discovery and the terms of erasure, these met at that moment of 2018. And the effort was to draw out questions of spirituality, which were in a way getting drowned out by the spectacularization of Eastman that was taking place, and also by, I think, the efforts of those institutions to a kind of institutional penitence, a certain sense of the institutions to show that they were on the right side of history by undertaking these conferences and exhibitions. And so all of these tendencies were converging on us in that moment in 2018, which brought a lot of psychic drama, a lot of political energy, a lot of aesthetic force, and a lot of charged sociality. And it made it a very compelling moment to participate in that project. And clearly the energies of that went in many different directions and could be pursued in many different ways. And so, I've spent a bit of time looking at how, in a way, what was important for me was that what we had was a vocabulary that, drawing on the work of Fred Moten and other scholars, could create that much more nuanced understanding of what is at stake in Black experimental composition, in Afro-diasporic experimental composition, such that we could open the field beyond the preoccupation with erasure or with recovery, and open up a much more complex field, precisely because we had a convergence of Black studies, and specifically the aesthetics of the Black radical tradition. And part of what was happening at that moment, I think, was the effort to treat critical Black studies as a traveling theory. And in the way Edward Said talks about what happens when theories move, and what happens when theories become the site of unexpected divergences. And that's what happens when you take theories formulated by Fred Moten, histories formulated by George Lewis, bring them to Berlin, draw a lot of people to Berlin, like Elaine Michener, draw a lot of composers and theorists like Josh Kuhn, like Suman Gopinath. Something very compelling happened. And I think the outcome of that, the diasporicity that is enabled by that, is really quite powerful. And so I'm still working through what happened then and what it enabled now. I think there is more attunement to the figure of the Black or Afro-diasporic experimental composer. They are no longer what Audre Lorde called a Black unicorn, an isolated, exceptional figure moving through a common garden with drawing admiration or shock and wonder as they go. No, there is a sense that Black experimental composition has always been there. It's an ongoing project, and it's ongoing wherever you look and see. So it's about the attunement to that, to those ongoing traditions, and the creation of occasions under which those projects can draw the attention and the value that they deserve, so that they can exert a pressure on the present and open up the field, you know. And that's an ongoing project, really, and it's a necessary one, because the forces of erasure have not just ceded ground. They haven't given way and disappeared. No, they are still operative. So the battle is on, but the battle will last a lifetime.
I like the idea. I hadn't heard that before. The unicorn theory of the black composer, or what my old student Dana Reason called the myth of absence, which he originally used to speak about contemporary women improvisers, experimental improvisers, but seems to have sort of wide currency as a sort of a catchphrase that can be very evocative in terms of the idea that, well, we didn't know those people were there, so we don't have to worry about them because they don't exist anyway. Or the idea that somehow those people are against the orders of nature, which, to cite my colleague here, Lorraine Daston, in her wonderful book, where that somehow the orders of nature, and there are these wonders that both that threaten the order of nature, but then by being wonders, they also become malevolent, threatening forces. So all of those things enter into the idea of the black composer. So that's something I've been interested in for a long time, but being able to connect that up with what I'm calling a kind of the need for a different identity for experimental music. You know, one that is diasporic, that's intercultural, that's cosmopolitan, that's not the celebration of European white diaspora, but that looks itself, which is not to say, I was trying to tease out in another essay that just got published, because a lot of this work on Julius has resulted in publications. I mean, you did your amazing film, the third part of the third measure, Autolith Group. I mean, there's so many things that came out of this. For me, it's centered on rethinking creolization as a means of encouraging these organizations that you were talking about to get on the right side of history. Look, I'm into cognitive dissonance. That is to say, you do the behavior first and then the belief follows. So I do want the behavior first. I don't believe or whatever, but I do want the behavior regardless of what the belief is. So, and perhaps the belief does follow the behavior, and then a certain transformation of consciousness comes into play for the field. And I think that's something I see that. In 2018, I also took the opportunity to, and Antonia's avatar is back. Are you there? Everything's okay?
Yeah, I lost some bits and pieces, I assume, but I can still follow.
You seem fine. I mean, I could go along with what I was going to say.
I'm gonna have it. Yeah.
You might have something.
No, go on. Go on.
Oh, well, it was just about the performance of Elegy in 2018, which was with Sean Griffin, the harpist, and actually the person who directed, he's also a director and composer and all kinds of things. He directed my first opera about the AACM afterward. And Elaine Michener, who I've been working with for years, and Elaine Michener introduced me to the Black British Afro-diasporic composer. We were sitting in some hall, we were about to listen to a piece of mine in Queen Elizabeth Hall, played by London Philharmonia Orchestra. And at intermission, she introduced me to Hannah Kendall, who was a fantastic composer. And I just said, well, wow, look at this, a young person who's doing great work. And this is what we need, 'cause we never hear about these people. So suddenly we're starting to hear more. So 2018 rolls around, she did this amazing performance, which looked like She was she had to train for it for months. It was very energetic. It reminded me of those old pieces of what is there, Melissa Fenley, where the dancers were moving all the time. You had this continuous, incredible energy that you had to do. And I also decided to try to play around with the idea of blackness in the German history and culture, which I was just using this as a means of doing research, and particularly around the vicissitudes of the term Neger, which is very complicated. And for example, there's the film by the guy who grew up in Germany, Hans-Jürgen Massaquoi, whose mother he was mixed race, basically Afro-German heritage. His mother tried to enlist him in the Hitlerjugend, and which didn't succeed. But he grew up during the Nazi site as a black kid. And then later he moved to the United States and became a senior editor of Heavy Magazine. And now there's a film about him that you can look up. It's called Neger, Neger, Schornsteinfeger, Neger, Neger, Chimney Sweep. And there's also a book. And he talks about his life at this time. And you often hear that Germany didn't have, you'll hear, for example, that Germany didn't have a particular investment in colonial expansion. Well, what do you do with Namibia if you believe that? So, or you often hear that Neger is not the same thing. It's not a bad word. It just means what you call colored people. So all these kinds of denial spaces, and then there are the classic things that people grow up with, seeing Kleine Negerlein, or so on and so forth. There's a bunch of these things. So I took all these and tried to create a piece meditating on the word nigger, including what Frantz Fanon said about it, including what Julius Eastman said about it, including what it's this wonderful black early British poet, I'm trying to think of her name right now, what she said about it. She had this incredible poem called Nigger. It was like...
Una Marson.
Una Marson, right, that's right. Thank you, that's great. And who Elaine introduced me to. And just tried to move around the world with this term to meditate on Eastman and to show that there was a commonality of experience there. There was also a long-standing meditation on this, a long-standing mode of not only resistance, but posing alternative realities. So that's what that piece was kind of about, and then what Sophia Jernberg did with, it was incredible.
Joanne.
Or what Raven did, amazing pieces.
And maybe this allows me to, because I think that's something that we really wanted to do in the program as well, was really to focus on his music, and to pause on the specificities of his music and, let's say, complexify also the musical traditions or references, like you do in Elegy, that led to his music, and that his music then also led to after. And so I think that in that sense it was also quite at times even speculative journey. If I think also of Josh Kuhn's contribution, imagining what type of musical scene Eastman might have encountered in the 70s in New York, that has not been part of the ways in which his music was just inserted predominantly into the minimalist canon, and John Cage as main sort of actors of references of that moment. So looking at hip hop, for instance, looking at border atonalism with the border with Mexico, looking into other musical traditions like Sumant Gopinath did, and I think this also had a very important political significance, precisely to avoid in a sense a certain generalization. That his work also seemed to be suffering because it was predominantly, tagged or written about under, as also Kodwo was saying, exclusively sort of aspects related to his body or his sexuality or his spirituality, but not actually pausing on the music. And that's why for us it was important to look at Buddha as a score, to relook at Joanna d'Arc, to relook at the ways he was actually even writing his scores, to look at the ways in which his musical writing also changed in the course of his life. For example, when he went completely bankrupt, and had actually was also, denied the possibility of using even so many, even pianos or orchestras that he could before, and that he, stopped having access to and excluded. I don't know when I was blocked here, I feel sometimes.
Just at the end of your
over again.
Yeah, maybe that's the best thing.
No, but to say that, and because you also introduced then, for example, the work that Savi, and it's interesting because Savi is installing the show on Halim El Dab right now. And it's really a work like to go back to the archives, that also somehow Mary Jane Leach also had started. Let's go back to the archives. Let's look at the scores. Let's reanalyze what was the music scene at the time. What were all the other types of music scenes that were not even considered under the, whatever Western new music canon. The club scene that he was so part of included, for example. And I think that this kind of commitment that in a way Savi is also doing programmatically, and in this case particularly also in collaboration with the Mertz music, continuing also with Halim El Dab, is like to also look at the music with wider context, but let's listen, which was, I think, a very important aspect of the program back then, and is still very present in the book right now, in the sense that a lot of his scores are also sort of engaged with, I don't know if you remember, there's Martin, who wrote also abundantly about Buddha, simply focusing on Buddha, for example, as a score. Sophia Jernberg, as you mentioned, which was reinterpreting the pieces Joanna d'Arc. This fabulous conversation that actually Julius Eastman has live, one of the few recordings also, in a proper interview with David Garland, where he's talking also about, his new moment of reconnection to life and love, actually, in one of maybe also the most difficult moments of his life. And all of this also somehow crosses through the book in order to I would say include really an analysis and a profound listening to the actual music, and hence also try to create a space that is hopefully inspiring for musicians or music scholars of the future.
I think Antonia's reached again.
This might be a
It'd be very. Kodwo, do you feel like talking about something else, like the film or something else?
Yeah, exactly. I was going to respond to what Antonia was saying by trying to connect it to the film. I was going to say that, you, in a way, I hear Antonia's point that you want to foreground the music. And I think that's because for a long while, all you had was the recordings.
Right.
I mean, the 7 or 8 years when there was only Unjust Malaise. Of course, if you met Eastman as you did and worked with him in the context of traveling and performing on tour in Europe, I think the Savvy moment was there was a differentiation between people who knew Eastman, composers, musicians, photographers, artists, historians who knew Eastman, like yourself, so who could call him Julius because they knew him, and then all of us who'd never met Eastman, and who could refer to him as Eastman, and who only knew his work through recordings. So the music is the impetus. and the moment, that moment of 2018 was about the movement from recording to performance. The first ever time I saw a performance was in the London Contemporary Music Festival, in which a lot of these compositions were performed, and that's winter of 2016, December 2016.
Who played the pieces? Do you remember?
Different people, Apartment House.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, of course. They played Feminine, incredible. They played, you know, the Joan of Arc composition. They played Stay On It. I mean, they played many compositions. That was the first time I think most British people had a chance to see and hear those compositions performed live. And so that means for 5, 6, 7 years before, it's all been about the recordings. In fact, it's about Unjust Malaise. That's it.
Yeah.
Like obsessing over that amazing triple CD. So in the beginning, there was only the music. And so then the movement from the recordings to performance to the dramatization of performance as a post-cinematic experience that can travel if you just happen not to be able to see a performance. That's the moment at which making a work like Third Part of the Third Measure becomes a challenge. Can we make a work that brings you face to face with a sonic experience, which is then heightened so that the sonic experience is not only one of commemoration, but seems to come from a future that we have not yet caught up with. So that a recording from the end of the 70s and the early 80s is performed in a present, which seems to beckon towards an impending future. That's the project of Third Part of the Third Measure, that the 4 highly skilled musicians, almost certainly the best interpreters of Eastman in the UK, they evoke a certain sense of mission and purpose and commitment and resoluteness. They have an esprit de corps, which enhances this sense of Eastman being this, Eastman's music fortifying you for the kinds of work you need to do, for the kinds of struggles that you will face, the struggles which are not only personal, but which are social and political. And I think that's because at that moment in time, Eastman was becoming a morally preeminent figure. So Richard Wright talks there's a Richard Wright essay in which he says there are certain moments in time when certain Black practitioners take on a moral preeminence and a moral value. That's a time we're living in now, with figures such as James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, Octavia Butler. They take on a moral preeminence. That's because people have been heightened by the proximity to death of cameras showing the deaths of George Floyd and so many more, and also the proximity to death of the pandemic. Those two things have created a heightened awareness of the enduring problems of racial capitalism and the resurgence of fascist activity in the US, but also I would argue in Brazil, India, and the UK. All of these things create a condition in which the music itself bears a certain import and a certain gravitas. And I think the third part of the third measure was, it was trying to speak to that sense that we had, that certain composers and certain musics carry an ethical value and an ethical standing about them. And that was very much the project. So the whole film is charged with a gravitas and an urgency which pins you to your chair and keeps you watching. And that's what we wanted to do, so that Eastman seems to be ahead of us and with us. The music is with you and beside you and by your side as you walk. So this effort to make the music a presence in your life, to make the music like a shield and an armor and a weapon and a means of preparing yourself and inhabiting a force, because there are real battles ahead. You know, that's the kind of thing that we were really keen on. And I think that sense of certain kinds of music as a certain kind of preservation of a certain kind of almost like a process of spiritual self-defense, and at the same time a kind of training in an ecstatic rigorousness. That's what Eastman's music gave me. And then the key was to find a form to share that and to transmit it so that it could go around the world. I can't go there. The four musicians cannot go all around the world, but that film can. That video can. In principle, it can go anywhere, and it needs to go anywhere. And so that is, then it's a question of, how can moving image contribute to this? Like, what can moving image do to make this work move and migrate? And that was the project then. And 3 years on, I mean, the question is the pluralization, the diasporicity of that impulse. So in a way, we say the Eastman's work is, as George said, was to open out onto the ongoing experimental impulses that are everywhere you look. Once you have the ears to hear them, it's everywhere. You will never stop finding great Afro-diasporic experimental composition. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
You just have to create the conditions required to attune yourself to that, and then the conditions required to share it, and then the conditions required to be changed by it, and then continue that in a way that the appetite for that experimental impulse to heighten it so that people will settle for nothing less than that. If you can do that, if you can create that sensitization so that afterwards people are like, why settle for anything less than that? Then you get a kind of exciting moment in which people have not only are people's consciousnesses raised, but people have the capacity to move ahead of the forces of erasure and the forces of silence, which have not stopped and which will never stop. But we can be ahead of them.
You know what? You just reminded me of something. This is really an aside, what you said about not settling for things. Around 1972, I used to play in a band with Pete Cozy.
Oh yes.
And it was an interesting band. It was Malachi Favors, Don Moye, Pete, and me, and Calaparusha.
Oh yes.
And I have recordings of several of the concerts. One of them, I just remember this. I listened to it many times, and I still have the recording. He says at one point, "So, don't accept cheap imitations. Always insist on great black music." So that's what I heard when you started singing. I heard that voice in my ear as if it was yesterday. And also, I don't know, maybe Antonia has been off for so long, but I just wanted, because of the glitches, but I just wanted say one other thing about the film. The film is, the music is part of it, but then there's also the way you, I don't want to call it dramatize, but somehow frame, perspectivize something. The famous Julius Eastman speech about the music, you know, I want to say a few words about the music, you know, and all that. And with Dante Michaud doing it in a kind of a cool way, and then Elaine coming in, Michener, and doing it in a kind of a hot way, having male and female doing it, certain kinds of dualities. You know, it's like bookending it and framing it. Dante says it, does the speech, the music starts, and then you go through a kind of transubstantiation. You're transformed, and in the end, he couldn't just come back. You're so transformed. You used to be Dante, and now you're Elaine. So, and you know, you're in a different place than when you started, and it's sort of made that. That's how the greatest music. That's what the greatest music can do. And that's what Julius's piece did, Evil Nigger. That's what it did on several other pieces. But the way you were able to show that in a very simple, understated, almost Zen-like way is amazing, you know. So that's, you know, not being much of a, you know, knowing much about film, I just had to say that was an incredible experience for me to see that.
Well, thank you.
Be able to. So yeah, let's. Are we talking about stuff, Antonia, that's not in the book? Because the other thing that came out, which might not be in the book, is what Peter Kotick said. Now, Peter, being from the it used to be the Czech Republic, it was Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
You know, he grew up under the whole thing when, you know, when the Soviets came in and when Dubček, was deposed, and even before that with Naj, the Naj government and the whole thing that. So he went through all that. And so he said something, I think it's on the video, if you could find it, he said, I realize now that what Julius was going through, I always compared it with what I went through as a person growing up under communism in the Czech Republic. But it wasn't like that. It wasn't, now I realize it's not like that at all. You know, it's not to say worse or better, but it's much more prevalent, it's much more persistent, you know. I mean, comparing the experience of living under white supremacy and having your forebears living under white supremacy and having 600, 400 years, 500 years of white supremacy, you know, living under communism for a few years is like a blip on the screen. So to have Peter come to that revelation as being, he and Julius founded the SEM ensemble, which is still going. So I think that has implications for the field.
Yeah.
So if Julius, someone who is much of an experimentalist as anyone else and was probably there when Julius upset John Cage, he was probably there at Buffalo when that happened, all that stuff, that he could see that Julius's experience had the potential for transforming even his view of his own history. I thought that was a pretty important moment, and I've known both of them a really long time, and he's known Julius a lot longer than I have. So
no, and actually I think he was even genuinely sharing almost an envy, in fact, which I think is something that was quite also peculiar in coming out in his contribution, in which, I think he had difficulty in even positioning himself in relationship to his legacy now and the influence he had on the group back then. But I also wanted to go back to something you were saying, Kodwo, which is, I think, in that moment, also 2016, you know, there was another publication, I think, that came out, which was almost at the same time, or actually shortly following probably the releasing of Anjas Malaise, which was this very tiny Julius Eastman booklet by Chimurenga, with also this kind of speculative journey around his life that the writer Stacey Hardy was also imagining without actually having all of the references, you know, that emerged later. But in thinking about how something, you know, so, I mean, it's one essay. it's small and very precise, and somehow it just traveled and had such an echo, and I think such a role, even in conjunction, of course, with the re-releasing of the music, that I think was quite that's quite fascinating, and I think also gives a lot of impetus even in continuing to invest in such efforts, in fact. And that I do think that they have an echo that is really, really hard to obviously predict in advance.
Oh my goodness. George, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Yeah, Antonia's having glitching problems. I mean, she was talking about Stacey Hardy's essay that Stacey wrote for Chimurenga, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, the 52 N word, that great essay.
Yes.
What were you going to go on to say, Antonia?
Sorry, because I think I've also got bits and pieces of your own contributions as well. I think I've exited a few times. But that it was a very interesting moment that year, 2016, because I think that text came right after Unjust Malaise, and how influential it actually has been in also, because I think Stacey Hardy, who I think also says it quite transparently at the beginning of the text, is that a lot of it is speculation around what his life may have been, and his relationship to certain musicians also may have been, and that somehow it really gave way, I think, to try to open up more and more really archives and materials that were absolutely inaccessible, which is also very interesting how Mary Jane Leach actually talks about it, in the book, as to even how to start a work that really hadn't been done yet, in a sense, and that there was a whole sort of Eastman folder that she was trying to create somehow with like bits and pieces of recorded conversations, a lot of recordings that were erased and got lost, calling back to small archives, radio archives, and then going back, of course, to the Buffalo University, but even having access to a lot of the archive material wasn't easy at all. And nothing. I was just saying that it was interesting how the releasing of that album gave way then to the publication of that text and to a renewed interest by a number of musicians that listened to it, and what that year was really. And I just wanted to also give, in a way, the credit really to Chimurenga for publishing it back then. And that was definitely a text that, arrived in one way or another at our desk as well. And this was also something we talked about a lot with, Bonaventure and Berno, actually. And what the little Chimurenga booklet did to a number of people that received it, and actually heard, the name of Julius Eastman really for the first time. I wanted to, because that's an introduction I should do, which is Kelly Krugman, who will be accessing the Common Garden and will actually do a reading of Joanna Dark, which is a brief text also that he wrote, more or less in the 80s as well, pretty much in the same period of...
Antonia's glitched again. I wonder why Antonia's avatar is having the problems it does.
Well, it might be that her connection is not that stable.
Yeah.
That's probably what it is.
Yeah. I mean, I think I agree that the role of Chimurenga are crucial, because in this same period of time, they've been embarked on these kinds of projects of what the Black Quantum Futurism group call temporal restitution and temporal reclamation. That's part of the project, Temporal reclamation is a larger way of talking about what is at stake in working with different archives, So I think that is the Chimurenga project, and that's the value of their work. But I also think of the the work of a figure like Harmony Holiday and her Afrosonic archives, her amazing poetry and her writing and her amazing mixes, which are, elegies and essays at the same time. I also think of the amazing resurgence of interest in the work of Nathaniel Mackey, for example, who's clearly a figure who's embarked on the same kinds of experimental imperatives. A figure who, in the 90s when I read Nathaniel Mackey, in reading Nathaniel Mackey in London, I couldn't find a soul to talk to about his work. I mean, for years,
Wow.
But now Nathaniel Mackey can sell out, Cafe Otto, and his books are selling all the time. Here in Berlin, the great bookstore Hopscotch can sell copies of Nathaniel Mackey. They go flying out of the Hopscotch bookstore. I mean, people love his writing, and it's part of that the kind of so the confluence of these thinkers: Fred Moten, Nathaniel Mackey, Harmony Holiday, yourself, Chimurenga. Part of what it is that all of these thinkers create a vocabulary with which to open up the discrepant engagement, to use Mackey's term, that is generated by these composers and by these compositions. So, the terms are there and the nuance is there, and the will to complexify and the love of complication is there. And that creates a very fertile ground in which these works of temporal reclamation and temporal restitution can become an ongoing project, not a project of exceptionalism, not a project of recovery, not a project of discovery, but something much more, something with a much larger scope and scale. That is the moment we're in now, and I see the savvy moment as both contributing to that and participating it, and in a way creating a space to articulate the stakes as people understood them at that moment in time. And now, to me, the vocabulary, to me, the frustration was that the greatness of the music. The music has always been great. That's never been in question. What is in question is the vocabulary required to account for and think with the music. To me, that the vocabulary was not just inadequate and insufficient for the music. The vocabulary, in many times, actively participated in the erasure of the music. So Eastman was always great. The music was always brilliant. So what was the problem? It was everything around Eastman, everything. The institutionality, the historiography, the discourse, the vocabulary, the terminology, the pedagogy, the curriculum, everything else was the problem. The music was never the problem. But if you have so it's not that all of those things have been resolved now. Of course they can't. But if you have at least a vocabulary that you can bring together, drawing on Moten, drawing on yourself, drawing on Harmony Holiday, drawing on Nathaniel Mackey, if you have that, then you can do we're in a much better position than in 2010 or 2005 or 2000. Things just feel a lot more generatively possible now. I see the appetite for complexity, the willingness not to punish and discipline complexity, but to attend to it and to give it its due, to create a frame and a context so that complexity takes on the generative capacities that it is designed to do. To me, that is more the case now than it was 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. And to me, the savvy moment, 2018 played its role in that, you know. And I like to think the third part also played its part in that. So this is why the savvy moment was important, and it's also why your forthcoming project is important, because unless you create these spaces to publicly process the stakes, so that people can actually articulate, the stakes of this music. These are ways in which people publicly acknowledge where the culture is at any moment in time. And that if you don't have those moments where a certain scene self-consciously recognizes and self-consciously takes part in a process of historicization, which is both retrospective and prospective, which is both commemorative and proleptic and contemporary. If you don't have those moments, you don't have a culture. You have isolated events and festivals, which is not enough and never has been, and certainly not now.
Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you all today in the digital for the launch of Julius Eastman's dedicated publication. I will be reading from one of his texts that is called Dear Joan from April 1st, 1981 in New York City. Dear Joan, find presented a work of art in your name, full of honor, integrity, and boundless courage. This work of art, like all works of art in your name, can never and will never match your most inspired passion. These works of art are like so many insignificant pebbles at your precious feet, but I offer it nonetheless. I offer it as a reminder to those who think that they can destroy liberators by acts of treachery, malice, and murder. They forget that the mind has memory. They forget that good character is the foundation of all acts. They think that no one sees the corruption of their deeds, and like all organizations, especially governments and religious organizations, they oppress in order to perpetuate themselves. Their methods of oppression are legion, but when they find that their more subtle methods are failing, they resort to murder. Even now, in my own country, my own people, my own time, gross oppression and murder still continue. Therefore, I take your name and meditate upon it, but not as much as I should. Dear Joan, when meditating on your name, I am given strength and dedication. Dear Joan, I have dedicated myself to the liberation of my own person, firstly. I shall emancipate myself from the materialistic dreams of my parents. I shall emancipate myself from the bind of the past and the present. I shall of love and devotion. Yours with love, Julius Eastman, one dedicated to emancipation. Now, Sagal Farah, from the Savvy team, reading Elaine Michener's contribution to the book
I
called
first heard the music
Eastman.
of Julius Eastman about 15 years ago and was not sure what to make of this rugged, rough, scrappy, fragmented sound world. A black avant-garde minimalist composer should sound cleaner and more precise. That was my initial response. I realize now, years later, and with a more mature and open musical ear, how fresh, vibrant, and daring his work and ideas were, and more connected to his African heritage, African American, African Caribbean. This vitality and directness is in contrast to the works of New York minimalist composers, who later became household names by their musical appropriation of non-Western cultures. Eastman fascinates and perplexes me. He was a composer, a choreographer, artist, and a singer. He had an ego, yet possessed humility. Flamboyant, straightforward, and introspective, as an activist, music was his vehicle for political and social commentary. Yes, others had done this too. But as a black man working in the white world of contemporary new music, this was highly unusual and dangerous. He would not be silenced. He was uncompromising with his life, and that speaks through his music. This fearless, barefaced honesty and integrity is rare and admirable. I first performed his music in 2016 with Apartment House for London Contemporary Music Festival. What an honour and responsibility. I was struck by the intense and exhilarating feelings of joy, provocation, anger, frustration, spirituality, resistance, and determination that I experienced when performing his work. And I could also hear and feel that energy from the audience. I admire Eastman's uncompromising approach to life, and as a black musician working in a similar music intersection myself, I draw strength from this notable figure who blazed the trail years ago. We're only just beginning to understand his cultural and musical significance. Although not directly linked to Eastman, by presenting the Nude Voice Solo 1 for Savvy Contemporary's Weekend of Invocations, I felt I could connect my personal understanding and experience of Eastman's aesthetic of directness and honesty in music. The idea of the nude voice was initially developed and presented as a duo with long-term collaborator, choreographer Dan Van Huyn. As a vocalist who works across experimental jazz, improvisation, and contemporary new music, Eastman's musical ideas and approaches are particularly pertinent to me. He successfully melded these tools without hierarchy, which was and is unusual. His seminal performance recording with Maxwell Davies' 8 songs for Mad King secured his place as a daring and brilliant vocalist, and it is hard to think of any other male classically trained vocalists who made such a significant mark during the same period. So, my connection with Eastman in the Nude Voice Solo 1 feels more spiritual. It is not about performance, it concerns a deeper truth beyond the bravura and trappings that performance brings with it, but an honesty and humility and struggle to express beyond words, to connect with a wider human experience that is universal, however raw the experience, and at whatever cost. The work probes the vocal instrument, this most individual and intimate of instruments, stripping it of language and using time as a tool to mold and remove the notion of inhibition and choice in vocal production and communication. The spontaneous voice is experienced in a vulnerable and exposed state of sound, open and naked. Deliberately slow, perpetual movement at the point of stillness serves as a counterpoint, revealing the body in a microscopic light, drawing the viewer's attention to the smallest detail. Time is suspended by the use of a sine wave that comes from silence and returns to silence, along with egg timers, each set up to ring during the 20 minutes duration of the work. The ticking of the timers diffuses and distorts the listener's perception of time. This musical device has been used by many composers, but most successfully by Ligeti and Eastman himself in Feminine. Each sound and movement is improvised and responding moment to moment, striving towards an open, honest, and raw state of being. The sine wave's dynamic grows from barely audible to unbearably loud and then dies away. The egg timers continue to tick away, a countdown of our life. 20 minutes of time that can never be recaptured.
We are tuning now into border atonalism, Josh Kuhn's lecture during the Invocations program in Berlin in 2018.
So Julius Eastman moved to Manhattan in 1976. And as most stories of his biography tell it, he arrived in Manhattan in the thick of minimalism and the rise of the so-called New York avant-garde. But what if we tell it like this? He arrived in Manhattan in the thick of disco and hip-hop. He arrived in Manhattan 6 years into DJ Pete Jones spinning sets at downtown, midtown, and Bronx clubs in which he, as early as 1969, was putting 2 copies of the same record on his turntables, isolating breakbeat sections, and mixing between the two to extend the breaks to keep dancers in motion by creating his own time worlds. Before Kool Herc's merry-go-round workouts and Grandmaster Flash's quick mixes, both perfected in the public parks of the South Bronx, Pete Jones was doing more like what Eastman was doing, working indoors, experimenting with time, rhythm, and repetitions. Jones used what we might call a minimalist machine, a Sony microphone mixer. And because people wanted to keep dancing, he became a time stretcher. He made 3 minutes become 10 minutes. He experimented with endurance and duration. As I listened to the Eastman performances just last week here in Berlin, I thought about Jones. This was an extended mix based on repetitions and recirculations of the same thing. Pete Jones knew, perhaps like Eastman, that he had to, in Jones's own words, extend those breakdowns. Jones was messing with fatback records, like Let the Drums Speak, Let the Drums Speak, Let the Drums Speak, Let the Rhythm Take Your Mind. Which we hopefully hear in a moment. Let's start again.
Let the drums speak, let the drums speak, let the rhythm take your mind. Let the drums speak, let the drums speak, let the rhythm take your mind. Let your love flow, let your love flow to a sweet and simple tune. Let your love flow, let your love flow.
3 years earlier, Eastman composed a piece that kind of sounded like a funk song. He called it Stay On It, a song that in its title alone could sit alongside Fatback's Put the Funk On You. Keep on steppin'. Eastman's repetitions may link him to minimalism and emerging practices of instrumental serialism, but they should also link him to the minimalist practices and instrumental serialism being developed in the laboratories of New York clubs and parks of the 1970s. What also funk, disco, salsa, and hip-hop heads called, as Fatback put it, New York style. So we might get something like this. Repetition as a figure of white New York experimentalism, much of it, of course, borrowed directly from Bali and Ghana, but to repetition as a figure in black culture, as James Sneed famously put it in his landmark 1981 essay in Black American Literature Forum. There, Sneed talks about James Brown and jazz improvisation and church music more than he does disco or hip-hop, but he was talking about what we just heard and what we're hearing, a language of cuts and breaks that is a language of music as long as music is a language of history and geography, a a language of diaspora and passage, a language of, to paraphrase Fred Moten, dispossession that becomes a critique of possession, a language of being held that is then a language of being held out, a holding out. The cut and the break are figures of black movement and black dispersal, but also black continuity. The changes played, the changing same, let the drums speak, let the rhythm take your mind, stay on it, stay on it. Stay on it. Keep on stepping, keep on stepping. On is the operative. Cut and break, but be on. Cut and break to stay on, back and forth, to keep the present moving. Extend those breakdowns.
And back to the invocations, we revisit George Lewis's piece, Elegy, performed together with Elaine Michener and Sean Griffin.
Stattdessen wird in diesem Jahr schon zum zweiten Mal eines 1990 verstorbenen Aktivisten für die Rechte von Schwulen und Schwarzen in den Vereinigten Staaten präsentiert, der am Ende erklärte, Musik sei für ihn secondary, im Klartext Nebensache. So ungefähr klingt sie auch.
Stattdessen wird in diesem Jahr schon zum zweiten Mal in großem Umfang das Werk von Julius Eastman, eines 1990 verstorbenen Aktivisten für die Schwulen und Schwarzen in den Vereinigten Staaten, der am Ende erklärte, Musik sei für ihn secondary.
Schwulen und Schwarzen in den Vereinigten Staaten,
Schwulen und Schwarzen in den Vereinigten Staaten, Schwulen und Schwarzen in den Vereinigten Staaten,
in den Vereinigten Staaten, Schwulen und Schwarzen in den Vereinigten Staaten,
in den Vereinigten Staaten, Schwulen und Schwarzen in den Vereinigten Staaten, Schwulen und Schwarzen in den Vereinigten Staaten.
They are the misunderstood people in the world. There's a wildness that they have, this special lack of restraint, a part of human life in certain black males, despite the reasons society says they're not supposed to have it. What you have is somebody who is fearless. It's a kind of self-flagellant resistance, opposed to accepted notions of progress, the lockstep life. Toni Morrison. I have discovered that most are afraid to admit to the world who they are. People fear punishment. There is always somebody who is trying to crush you. I refuse to be afraid of my own comrades, of being castigated, thrown out, or thought of badly. Julius Eastman. What I am trying to achieve is to be what I am to the fullest. Black to the fullest. A musician to the fullest. A homosexual to the fullest. It is important that I learn how to be. By that I mean accept everything about me. Julius Eastman.
I finally asked, what are you? You said you didn't know. I said, you a nigger. You start crying. We all laughed and said, here, nobody wants to be a nigger.
That I remember, that's all that I remember. That's all that I remember.
You know, everything that happened, they got to be a nigger in it.
Remember.
I use gay gorilla in hopes that
when I disobey, when I make too much noise, I am told to stop acting like a nigger. Franz Fanon.
What are you? You said you didn't know. I said
I was a nigger for 23 years. I gave that shit up. No room for advancement. Richard Pryor.
That's all that I remember.
Never give up your right to act like a nigger. Randall Kennedy.
I use gay gorilla in hopes that I might be one, if called upon. I use gay gorilla in hopes that I might be one, if called upon to be one. That's what I mean by in hopes that I might be one, if called upon to be one. That's what I mean by nigger in hopes that I might be one, if called upon to be one.